Tov is Nedarim Membeis, Nedarim 42. Today's Daf Yomi, we're going to start on top of 42a. Daf Yomi tells us the following. We're going to start with the Mishnah. Hamudar Nami Chavero Lifnei Shaviyah. So somebody who was prohibited to have any benefit from somebody else, let's say Shimon, is not allowed to get benefit from Reuven. And this vow happened before Shimon. Then since it's any benefit whatsoever, Shimon's not allowed to go into Reuven's field. And he's not allowed to eat from those fruits that are hanging outside the field onto the road. Even though he's not in his field, he's still not allowed to eat from those fruits. And during the sabbatical year, in the sabbatical year, he's not allowed to go into his field because the person still owns the field. Reuven would still own his field during the sabbatical year. But he would be allowed to eat from those trees that overhang because those trees are not going to be considered like Reuven's because they're onerous in the sabbatical year. During the sabbatical year, we say all the fruits of the fields are onerous, so therefore, he's allowed to eat from those trees. Nedarim machal. So let's say he took a vow that he's not going to eat any food from him, not a vow against all benefit, but a vow against all food. So under those conditions, if it was Lifnei Shviyas, if he took this vow prior to the sabbatical year, then he's going to be allowed to go into his field because it's only a vow against the sabbatical year. It's only a vow against eating. It's not a vow against entering into his field. But he's not going to be allowed to eat from the fruits because he's not allowed to eat his food. And in the sabbatical year, since the food is onerous, he's going to be allowed to go in and eat it. So the Gemara is going to offer at first two separate approaches to this Mishnah. One is the approach of Rav and Shmuel, the other is the approach of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. And so the Gemara first starts by saying, Rav and Shmuel, the Amri Chavayu, they both teach the following. And if a person says these vows, let's say Reuven has said to Shimon, these possessions that I have are prohibited upon you. These possessions are prohibited upon you. If he says this before the sabbatical year, and then he's not allowed to go into his field. And he's not going to be allowed to take from those fruits that are overhanging. And even though the sabbatical year happens, he's still going to remain prohibited in those fruits. Meaning to say he takes the vow before the sabbatical year, and once the sabbatical year happens, he remains prohibited. Once the prohibition occurs, it remains. The prohibition survives it, even though during the sabbatical year it becomes onerous. Since it had become prohibited while it was still in his possession, it's going to remain prohibited. But if he makes the vow during the sabbatical year, if he makes the vow during the sabbatical year, then he's not going to be allowed to enter into his field, but he can eat from the trees. Eat from the trees that hang over. So Rav and Shmuel, the Ran explains the position of Rav and Shmuel and basically says that there's two chidushim in the din of Rav and Shmuel. First of all, the Ran says that Rav and Shmuel are of the position that even though the sabbatical year happens and then all the fruits are onerous, since the vow happened while it was still in this person's possession, therefore the prohibition remains even during the sabbatical year when it's gone out of his possession. And therefore, according to Rav and Shmuel, our Mishnah is really teaching us two separate cases. The first case is teaching us that since he made the vow before the sabbatical year, the vow applies, even when it comes to the sabbatical year. And then the next clause is teaching us that if he makes the vow in the sabbatical year, even though we made the vow in the sabbatical year, and so therefore the fruits are completely permitted, nevertheless, it's teaching us it's still going to remain prohibited to enter into his field. So those are the two dinim that Rav and Shmuel are learning in our Mishnah. First of all, that the fruits remain prohibited if they were prohibited before the sabbatical year. And second of all, if he makes the vow in the sabbatical year, yes, the fruits will remain permitted, will be permitted because he can't vow those fruits, they don't belong to him. But we will say that the land itself is not going to be allowed into because the land is this person's. So that's the first teaching of Rav and Shmuel. Comes along Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and they argue with Rav and Shmuel. Presumably they argue, but we'll see at the end of the Gemara. We'll see that they're not arguing. But Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish seem to be arguing with Rav and Shmuel because the Amri Travayu, they say that if a person says Nechasi alecha, my possessions are prohibited upon you, as opposed to saying these possessions, he emphasizes the word my possessions are prohibited upon you with Neishvias. If he says this before the sabbatical year, then he's not going to be allowed to go into his field. Okay, because he says my possessions are prohibited upon you, so then Shimon will not be allowed to go into the field and will not be allowed to eat from the trees. But but according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, once the sabbatical year comes, then we're going to say we still can't go into his field because his field is prohibited during the sabbatical year. But he can eat from the fruits, meaning to say, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say, even though it was prohibited prior to the sabbatical year, once the sabbatical year happens, the fruits become permitted. So this is an area where Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing with Rav and Shmuel, presumably, that they're saying once something was permitted prior to the sabbatical year, even though it was prohibited prior to the sabbatical year, once the sabbatical year comes, it will become permitted. So therefore, the Gemara says, let's assume that what's the core dispute between Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? Must be that the core dispute is the Rav Shmuel Sabri, that they're of the position Adam Oser Davar Shabar Shuso Afil Kashiyetzi Bershuso. If there's something in a person's possession, person has the ability to prohibit it upon somebody else, even when it leaves his possession, and so therefore he's able to say that this fruit, even though it will become outside of my possession in the sabbatical year, I'm still going to be able to prohibit it upon you. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would say, no, while it's in my possession, I can prohibit it upon you, but once it leaves my possession, I'm not going to be able to prohibit it upon you. Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish Sabri, whereas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they say, no, a person cannot prohibit something in his domain for when it leaves its domain. So the Gemara says, do you really think that that's the core dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and Rav and Shmuel? Is there really anybody at all who argues with the idea that you can't prohibit something? Who argues with this idea and says that you can't prohibit something that's in your domain for when it leaves your domain? Meaning the idea that you can prohibit something once it leaves your domain, that's agreed upon by everybody. That's what the Gemara says. And Gemara says, I'm going to give you two proofs that a person should be able to prohibit something that's in his possession for when it leaves his possession. I'll give you two questions that on your interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who you say cannot prohibit something once it leaves your possession. First problem with that approach is in Cain, if it's really the case that a person cannot prohibit something that's in his possession after it leaves his possession, then why would Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish change the formula of Rav and Shmuel? Rav and Shmuel said, if a person says, these possessions are prohibited upon you, then even when it leaves, if Reuben says these possessions are prohibited upon you, then when it leaves Reuben's domain, it still remains prohibited. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish changed it to saying my possessions are prohibited upon you, then it will become permitted. The implication is that if it would say these possessions, it would remain prohibited. Otherwise, why would they change it from these to mine? Because these is a greater chiddush. If you're saying that if you say these possessions will remain prohibited, for sure my possessions will remain prohibited. Excuse me, if you're saying these possessions will become permitted, then for sure in the case where you say it's my possessions, when it will be permitted, because it's not your possessions anymore. So therefore, from the fact that Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan changed it from the formula from nechasim elu to nechasai, from these possessions to my possessions, it's proof that they say in the case of these possessions, it should remain prohibited. It's only in the case of my possessions that it becomes permitted. That's the first point that they're saying. That meaning to say that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree in the case of these possessions are prohibited upon you, that it will remain prohibited after it leaves my possession. And the second thing is we have a Mishnah in Nedarim, which we're going to get to. We have a Mishnah that says, we have a Mishnah in Baba Kama, and we're also going to get to it later on in the Nedarim, Mem Zayin. Tanana Omer would know that if a person says to his son, Konem Shatan Nenoi, person says to his son, I take a vow that you're not allowed to have any benefit from me. Rahman al-Atlan, somebody says that to his son, mace, and then the father dies. Yeroshenu. Well, since he only said you can't have benefit from me, after he dies, the son can inherit him. But let's say he says to his son, you're not allowed to have any benefit from me, b'chayai, ub'mosai, you're not allowed to have any benefit from me while I'm alive, and even after I'm dead. Then he's trying to prohibit something. Once he leaves his possession, after he's dead, it's no longer in his possession. Then under those circumstances, it may slow Yeroshenu. Then under those then we say in that situation, if he dies, his son will not be able to inherit him. So we see from here on the top of Mem Beis and Beis, in the case where he says that you can't have benefit from me while I'm alive and even after I'm dead, that the prohibition of benefit even survives when it's no longer in his possession. So we see that everybody's in the position that if something is prohibited, it remains prohibited after it leaves his domain. So the Gemara answers, so how can we say Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish say it becomes permitted after it leaves his possession? So the Gemara says, Shani Yachan. No, that case is different. The case where he says B'chayai Mosai, that case is different. The Ka'amoi B'chayai Mosai, where he says B'chayav B'mosai, he says in his lifetime and in his death, meaning he specifies that I want this to remain prohibited. Our question really was in a case where he doesn't specify, where it's not clear from the language. A person just takes a vow upon somebody about this possession. In that case, where it's not clear, does it remain prohibited after it leaves his possession? That's the case where Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are arguing with Rav and Shmuel. But in a case where he clearly specifies that it's going to be prohibited, for sure, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish would say that it remains prohibited. Everybody would say it remains prohibited. Everybody agrees that you have the ability to make something prohibited after it leaves your possession. The question is, what is the baseline language? What is the understanding and the intent of the regular language? So the Gemara says, but still, mikol makom kasha, but still, we have the first difficulty, that if indeed Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish say that in the case of nechasim elu, it will remain prohibited, then why would they change the formula to nechasai, to my possessions? Nechasai implies that only in that case is it going to be permitted, but in the case of nechasim, it would remain prohibited. So therefore, it seems that in the case of nechasim, they're not arguing with Rav and Shmuel, that it remains prohibited. So the Gemara says, you're right. Let's say like this. If he says it's these possessions, everybody agrees that it remains prohibited. They only argue in the case where he says my possessions. That where Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish said it becomes permitted after he leaves his possession. Rabbi Shmuel Savri, Adam, Oser, Rav and Shmuel say it doesn't matter if you say my possessions or these possessions, it actually will become permitted. It doesn't matter. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan, it will remain prohibited. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish Savri Nechasim Elu Adam Oser Nechasai Ein Adam Oser. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish they argue, say if they say these possessions, then it's prohibited. But if you emphasize my possessions, then it actually will become permitted after it leaves his domain. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish seem to be saying, if you say my possessions, it still remains prohibited. Gemara says, wait, you mean to say that Rav and Shmuel have the position, Miko and Mount Amar, is it really such a shita out there, such a position, that it doesn't matter if you say these possessions or my possessions, it remains prohibited. But what about the Mishnah? We're going back, Ezra Hashem Yisbarach, we're going to get to, God willing, Bli Nedarim on Nedarim Mem Vav. What about the Mishnah which states, somebody says to his friend, Konem Utoch Beisla Shani Nichnas. He says, I take a vow that I'm not going to enter into your field. I'm not going to enter into, excuse me. I take a vow, I'm not going to enter into your house. Or Sadcha Shani Lokeach. Or he takes a vow that he's saying, I'm not going to go into your field, and I'm not going to buy your field. In both of these circumstances, since he says, I'm not going to buy your house, or I'm not going to buy your field, therefore, both of these circumstances, let's say he dies, or he sells the field to somebody else, then it's going to be permitted. Meaning, say, if he specifies my field or my house, then once it leaves his possession, it's going to be permitted. This is not like Rav and Shmuel, who say that it always remains prohibited. But in this case, we say if he specifies your house and your field, it will become permitted after it leaves his possession. However, if it says Labayas Zesh Ani Nechnas or Sada Zesh Ani Lokech, says this house or this field, then and if he dies, or if it becomes prohibited to somebody else, or he sells it to somebody else, then it still remains prohibited. So we see very clearly that this Mishnah, this Stam Mishnah, is drawing a distinction between your house versus a house. That your house, once it leaves your possession, will become permitted, whereas a house will remain prohibited. This is a direct question on Rav and Shmuel say that even if it's your house or my house, it will become. Then it will, they say, it will remain prohibited, whereas in our Mishnah it says it becomes permitted once it leaves the domain. So the Gemara says, you know what? We take it all back. Ella, actually, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish are not actually arguing with Rav and Shmuel. They just said their laws. They both were speaking about two different scenarios. Ella, Kiyami, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, B'nechasai. When did Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish say that once it leaves its domain, his domain is permitted? That's where he said b'nechsa. He says my possessions are prohibited upon you. Once he leaves his domain, it's permitted. That's the case. They were just speaking in a way in a situation where he said nechasai. Whereas Rav and Shmuel taught b'nechasim elu. Rav and Shmuel just happened to say their din in a case where they said these possessions. Neither one is arguing with each other. They just said their din in two separate cases. So the Gemara says, let's cite the next line of the Mishnah, that the Mishnah had said that if they made the vow in the sabbatical year, if they made the vow in the sabbatical year, he's not allowed to go into his field. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said, that if he made the vow in the sabbatical year, and he's not allowed to have any benefit from him, then he's not allowed to go into his field, but he could eat from the netios, but he could eat from the fruit that's overhanging into the public domain. So it says the Mishnah, says the Gemara, why is he allowed to eat from the fruit that's hanging into the public domain? To bear a defkera inun. because the fruit is hefker, because during sabbatical year, nobody owns their fruit. Everybody can take any fruit they want. You can knock on anybody's door in Jerusalem, say, yeah, I'm going into your backyard to get your tree, to get your fruit from your tree. Everybody owns it. It's sabbatical year. It's ownerless. And so therefore, if that's the case, Aranami FKRA, so why is he not allowed to go into his field, into his land? In case where he says, I'm not allowed to, remember what we say in our Mishnah, he says, if he makes the vow in the sabbatical year that I'm not going to get any benefit from you, he's not allowed to go into his field, but he is allowed to go into he is allowed to eat his fruit. Well, if you say he's allowed to eat his fruit because the fruit is hefker, he should be allowed to go into his land because the land should be hefker also. So the Marit has a little bit of a different version. He says, Aranami Rahmana Afkera. He says the land also, the Torah has made hefker. So, and he wants to learn from this that the sabbatical year takes effect even without the owner of the field doing anything. Meaning to say, even if it's a non-Jewish field, that it's ownerless. And not like the Beis Yosef, who says that everybody has to actually take a proactive action of making it ownerless. So that's what he wants to say. The Rahmana made it hefker. So why don't we say that you could go into the field because the field is ownerless? So Ula gives one answer. Amar Ula says, no, what are we talking about here? Ba'omdin ilanos alakvulin. That we're talking about a situation where he doesn't need to go into the field. We're talking about a situation where the trees are standing on the border. The trees are basically on the border of his property, but the fruit is going outside the property. Look at the Mefarish. I read the Mefarish. The trees are standing on the border to outside. He can pick the fruit without going into his field. And that's the reason why he can't go into the guy's field. That's why Shimon can't go into Reuven's field, because when does we say that the Torah made the fields ownerless? That's only if you want to eat it. But you can't go into there unless you're going for the purpose of eating. So he wants to go in and just have a suntan in the guy's field. That's not allowed. You're only allowed to go in for the purpose of eating. Okay. So there's a lot to talk about that idea as well, but we'll go on now. Rabbi Shimon ben Yaakov says, well, we had this similar case by Bikur Cholam. Remember, we said by visiting the sick that you have to stand, you can't sit, because we're worried if you're going to sit, you're going to stay there too long. And the Gemara had cited this answer, Rabbi Shimon ben Yaakov, as an answer to that question of why there's a difference between standing and sitting. Here the Gemara says that what's the reason why you can't go into the field? It's not talking about an ukimta situation where the trees are on the border and therefore you can't go into the field because you could have gotten it from the outside. No, we're talking about a situation where we're concerned that if you're going, it's just a decree that if you're going to go into the field, then we're concerned that under these circumstances, you might end up waiting there too long. And so as a result of this, you're going to be in violation. We'll read the Mefarish here again. Rabbi Shimon ben Yaakov says, so that where it states that you can eat from the trees, okay, it's like what we're talking about where you're standing on the border, and because you could stick in your hand and take it from the outside. But if in a situation where, the Mefarish says, in a situation where the trees are not on the border, or you wouldn't be allowed to go into the field. Why? Because it's a decree that after you eat the food, you're going to remain there, and then you're going to be benefiting from those possessions which are prohibited upon you, and that which the Torah, the high, the Afkarei Rachmana calls Manshu Ochel. The Torah says that you're allowed to go into the field only when it's hefker, but after only to eat the food. But after you ate the food, then the Torah didn't say it's onerous, and then you're standing in the person's domain. And we pass like Rabbi Eliezer, who says vitor, that vitor is prohibited, that even a small benefit is prohibited. It's just being in his field is prohibited, and therefore it's not going to be allowed. So the way the Mefarish reads it, Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim is explaining an answer, is explaining, going further than the first approach. He's not even necessarily arguing with the first approach. Okay, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, happy to address them.